Okay, so I thought we'd start talking about your most recent book,
Okay.
A Tale for the Time Being. And I was interested that you've, right from the start, made a very deliberate blurring of the line between reality and fiction by calling your main character Ruth.
Yes.
And she shares so many things in common with you, such as a partner's name and location and profession.
Yeah.
Why did you choose to do that?
Yeah. There were, of course, many reasons.
Yeah.
When I first started writing the book in 2006, the book kind of came to me through the voice of the young girl Naoko Yasutani. And at that time, because, I was hearing this girl's voice, and she was writing this diary, and I knew that she was writing a diary, and I knew that somebody would be reading the diary, right? It did occur to me early on that perhaps I was the reader. I was the person who was going to, be reading the diary. Because I was, literally I was. And so it occurred to me early on to put myself in as a fictional character in the book. But then as soon as I thought that, I also discarded it quite quickly because it just seemed very, sort of metafictional and postmodern for all of the kind of wrong reasons. And so I discarded that idea and then proceeded to audition other characters for that role.
Okay.
Right. And so I tried, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 different characters in that role of the reader. And, and I'd a character would kind of come in and, and I'd write, the story with the character in place and, maybe hit, I don't know, 100 pages, 50 pages, 100 pages or something. And then, the story would kind of go flat. So then, I knew that wasn't working. So I'd sort of show that character the door and then invite the next character in. And it was kind of like auditioning,
Do you remember the details of some of the readings?
Yes. Oh,
and why they didn't work?
Yeah. I don't know why they didn't work, but there were, a variety. I mean, they were just wrong. Some of them were, there was one character who was an older man. Then there was a character who was a younger man. At first, I really thought it would be good to have a man in that role. But neither of those characters worked. Eventually, I wrote a character who was so vague. And this was kind of a challenge to see if I could do it. The character had no gender or no age. The character, spoke in the first person, so was never identified by a pronoun, for example. You knew specific details about that character, but you never knew the character's name, right? And I actually finished a draft of the entire book with this kind of nebulous character in place. And I thought there were conceptual reasons why I thought that would be interesting. Unfortunately, it was really, really bad. It didn't work at all. It was a terrible idea. But, it was interesting, right, as a kind of a thought experiment. I finished a draft of a book with this character in place, and I got as far as submitting it to my agent. And we were going to, turn it into my editor. And I knew that it wasn't working, but I also didn't quite know how to fix it. So, we were going to move forward with it. And that was in 2011 when the tsunami, the Japanese tsunami, earthquake and tsunami hit. And as soon as that happened, I realized that, Japan was a different place and, the world was a different place. Yeah. And I had written a book that was pre-earthquake and tsunami. And it was really clear to me that the book was not going to work, and I needed to withdraw it, so I did. And then I spent the next couple of months kind of thinking about it, and it really it raised a lot of very interesting questions about about fiction writing. How, as a fiction writer, does one respond to an event of that catastrophic magnitude? And still, write fiction. And especially since it was an event that was still unfolding. And I knew that it was going to continue to unfold, forever. It was, the meltdown at Fukushima was just starting to, we were just starting to understand, the extent of the damage. And it was so current and it was so huge that the only way I felt that I could respond to it was by, in a way, kind of breaking the fictional container and stepping out so that then, and literally kind of putting myself on the line, and so that I could respond to it in a more direct way. And so that's really, how that happened. I spent, several months talking this over with my husband, Oliver. Yeah. And finally he said, it sounds like the only solution is for you to be the character in the book. Yeah. And, I thought about that and I said, well, that's all fine and good. But, of course, if I'm in the book, then you have to be a character in the book too.
How did you feel about that?
And he said he agreed. He thought it was fine. He said he thought it would be an interesting thought experiment. But too, I think that, he's a visual artist, and, filmmakers and visual artists are they're much freer about putting themselves, self-portraiture is an established, part of visual arts in a way that it's not in fiction writing, in writing, because we still kind of adhere to these, kind of slightly prurient distinctions about what's fiction and what's not fiction, right? And so I don't know why exactly we're finicky about that, in the writing world, but we seem to be. So this it was an interesting experiment to kind of try to break that and step out and do something different. Yeah. Yeah.
It's really interesting that you started writing the book before the tsunami happened, because the tsunami is the delivery method of Naoko's diary to Ruth.
That's right, yeah.
It's also really interesting that Naoko's voice was the first voice that came to you, because she's got such an authentic teenage voice, such a vivid and idiosyncratic way of expressing herself, and her life is so different from Ruth's. Yeah. How did you... Well, it sounds like it just popped into your head, but how did you get inside the head of a Japanese teenager with such effectiveness? And her life is so different, and you get really into the particularities of her daily life.
Yeah. I've lived in Japan for many years. I've known Japanese teenagers. Of course, this was quite a while ago, but I'm quite familiar with the culture in that respect. Unlike the character of Ruth in the book, who doesn't know much about Japanese pop culture, I actually do know quite a bit about Japanese pop culture, and I watch films. I read manga. I'm familiar with this, certainly more than the character in the book is. But the other thing too is that I think there are certain characters who I feel they come to me in a very kind of powerful way. I hear them, so it's not I don't really feel as though I'm writing the character of now. It's more like she's kind of parasitizing me and using me as a way of expressing, as a kind of a vehicle to express herself. It's an odd feeling, but I do sometimes get this sense that there are these, kind of characters out there, in the ether, sort of swimming around in this, like this Pirandelian soup, this kind of primordial soup, just sort of waiting for the right novelist to show up so that they can, kind of jump on board and find their way into the world.
Now's got quite a difficult story. She's she's got a difficult family life. She's got a father that is really struggling, and a mother that is struggling with quite a challenging situation as well. And there's some things that happen to her that are quite cruel and difficult to read. I wondered how you went about writing those scenes where Now is sort of subjected to some quite cruel situations.
Yeah. Well, she's being bullied. She's being terribly bullied in school. Yeah. And I've been... bullying is something that's been talked about a lot, and is talked about a lot in Japan. It's in the news all the time. It appears once again in film, in young adult stories. It's a very powerful trope, I suppose, in Japanese youth culture, and it dates back. It's also it's something that is talked about in the military, for example, too. In corporate institutions, bullying is kind of almost a part of a training program for people who are just entering the company. So and you can call it bullying, or you can call it indoctrination, or anything else. But in any case, there's a it's talked about a lot more in Japan than I feel it's talked about in the West. I think that's changing because I think that something's happening now where bullying and I think it's because of the internet. Cyberbullying is becoming something that we talk about now and we're worried about now. But bullying is always there. I think it's always there in any youth culture. It's just that in Japan it is talked about more. And in any case, I've been following these certain kinds of stories about teen bullying that's been followed by suicide. Probably I've been reading about this since the early 90s, and it's something that I've been watching and have been concerned about, partly because I've noticed that if things surface as a phenomenon in Japan, it doesn't take very long for it to kind of swing around to the rest of the world as well. And so it wasn't surprising to me at all, this past year, for example, in Canada, where we had 2 instances of teen girls being cyberbullied, who then committed suicide, afterwards, as a result of that. So it's something that I think, it is being talked about more and more. And so the stories that I wrote about in the book were based on accounts that I had read over the years as I've been kind of tracking this as an issue.
There's a moment in A Tale for the Time Being where, perhaps more so than any of your other books, things happen that could best be described as fantastical. There's kind of a moment or a few moments where we really take a bit of a leap from what we know to definitely being concrete reality, to slightly more mysterious and mystical things happening to this diary. Was this your plan at the start, or is that something that happened during the writing of the story?
There was always a sense that things were going to happen that were magical. And I think it's because ultimately it's a story about writing. It's a story about a writer and a reader and their relationship. And, to my mind, that's about the most magical, thing that I've ever experienced in my life, the magic that happens between writers and readers. And so I knew that there was that there were going to be sort of, for lack of a better word, kind of magical realist elements to the book. But it wasn't until I actually stepped in as a character, as a kind of a semi-fictional character, that I started to understand. It kind of thrilled me to think that, here's this character who people are going to think, is real, and then to have these kind of destabilizing magical realist kind of moments happen to sort of disrupt that expectation. It was fun. It
was fun to read as well. I mean, it came as a great surprise to me, and I thought it was quite fun. Yeah. The other thing is, I guess you quote Zen text, and Zen ideas are much more at the forefront of this book than in your other books. Is that something that you also set out to do from the beginning?
Well, the book is a response very much to a lot of the reading and the practice, the Zen practice that I've been doing over the years, and in particular. It must have been in the early part of the decade. I was, in other words, 2000, 2001, 2002, that I was reading a lot of the writings by this 13th century Zen master named Dogen Zenji. And he writes beautifully on the subject of time. And so I spent months reading and studying, his writing, and the book very much kind of grew out of the practice and the study that I was doing. So in a way, it's a kind of you could read the book as a kind of a commentary on the Dogen fascicles.
Yeah. How easy do you think it is to transmit those ideas to a Western audience? And did you have difficulty selecting which fragments of text and which ideas to try and communicate?
Well, Dogen is very, very dense, and it's not something that you can kind of understand intellectually. I think it's really it's got to be kind of, his writing has to be experienced, and there is a sense that you practice with these texts. You don't just read them and study them, but you have to you practice with them. You put your body on the line, and so this is really ties into this idea of the practice of Zazen. Zen meditation as well. So, in the book, the challenge was to figure out a way of almost performing these ideas, performing this philosophy, so that, you take something like impermanence. How do you perform impermanence on the page? Or the notion of interconnectedness. In Buddhism, it's called dependent co-arising, right? How do you perform that on the page? And actually, I think that in a way, fiction is ideally suited to doing that. Literally embodying these ideas and sort of bringing them to life through the characters and their actions. It seems like an ideal way to do that. It's not traditional, perhaps, but it seems really well suited to it.
Yeah, you do it very well. And I sort of think one of the hallmarks of your writing is your ability to incorporate very complex ideas or issues and embody them through characters. So much so that it's seamless, it's not tacked on or there's not a lecture being delivered.
Good.
With your other books, All Over Creation, where you discuss GMO crops, and My Year of Meats, where you really get into what happens in large-scale meat farming. What was the genesis of those two books? Did they start with the issue or the idea, or have they, again, similar as A Tale for the Time Being, has their starting point being character for you?
I think the starting point is always character, but the character has to come from someplace, right? And the character's, problems and actions all have to have a genesis someplace, else, and that someplace else is usually in my own life somehow. So, for example, My Year of Meats was very much, based on experiences that I'd had that were very similar to the protagonist, in the book. Working in television, doing a, kind of a televised cooking show for Japanese TV, that is being sponsored by the meat industry. All of this is stuff that actually happened to me in real life too. And so the book is kind of a fictional playing out of scenarios that had arisen during the time that I was performing a similar kind of job. Yeah. So that and there were certain kinds of thematic, through lines in the book that I think were, concerns of mine, during the time that I was actually doing that kind of work. For example, the question about, what is authenticity, and how do you authentically portray a culture? What is the relationship between, sort of what we perceive as real and, the corporate sponsorship that, is driving that perception of reality. These were things that, that as I was working in corporately sponsored television, arose for me in very concrete ways and worried me, And I think that's the main thing, is just that the books usually grow out of some kind of, something that I'm really worried about, and so the book ends up being a way of exploring that worry. It can be, worry is one way to talk about it. Fear is another way to talk about it. In the case of, for example, GMOs in All Over Creation, there's something about that technology that's deeply disturbing to many people, and myself included. And so the book was a way of kind of exploring that and asking these questions and trying to come up with ways of understanding.
You do take a very even-handed approach, I find, though, in your books, where you tend to explore both sides of the issue and don't provide the easy answer or take one side. Is that something that comes easily to you, or is that a matter of balancing?
Yeah, I'm not an activist. I don't take this on as a with an agenda, to turn everybody into vegans or to, to change people's minds about GMOs. It's much more personal than that. I'm writing about these things because they concern me, and if readers want to come along for the ride, that's great. But it's more exploratory. It's more, it's an inquiry, I suppose, not a polemical kind of statement. So it's, people always say, there are a lot of issues in your books. Well, they're not really issues. I don't think of them. I don't conceive of them that way. It's more like they're questions, and how do you frame those questions?
What I should also mention is your books are very, very funny.
Oh, good.
I find myself laughing quite frequently when I read them, and I really like the way that you very gently satirise and poke fun at certain sorts of people. So I'm thinking of the Seeds of Resistance, or perhaps some of the American meat cooking wives. Is this you? Is this your personality? Would your friends say that this is how you are in real life? That you like to poke fun.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you know, I also think that that humor is you know, it's the flip side of comedy is the flip side of tragedy, right? They're not and they're not really oppositions. You know, they don't really exist in opposition to each other. They're kind of the same thing. Right. There's a very thin line dividing, funny from tragic. And so, to kind of play that line and, to sort of investigate both sides of that seems like, it's a powerful, I think, tool that, I certainly didn't invent, and, I mean, this is why Shakespeare always has clowns in the tragedies, right? I mean, there's a reason for that. So, it's not like you set out to write funny.
Yeah.
It's just that you're exploring these kinds of things, and funny is what happens.
Yeah. I don't know if you can talk about this, but maybe just finally, I'd like to know: are you working on something at the moment?
I am not actively working on anything right now. I'm, passively working on something, and I'm thinking about it, and it's probably too early to start talking about it.
Yeah.
Because once again, I do find that, that stories have a kind of an energy to them. And secrecy is, keeping secrets is like important.
Okay, yeah.
So I could try not to talk about these things.
Hold on to that secret.
Yeah, exactly.
We'll be patient and wait for the secret to emerge.